On Tuesday, April 29th, 2026, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said something that no European leader had said publicly about an American military operation in decades. Standing before high school students in Germany, Merz said, "The Americans obviously have no strategy." He said Iran was humiliating the United States. He compared the Iran war to the American invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. "This situation is, at least, ill-considered," he said. "And I do not see at the moment what strategic exit the Americans are choosing now." By Wednesday, Trump had posted, "The Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, thinks it's okay for Iran to have a nuclear weapon. He doesn't know what he's talking about." By Thursday, Trump was reviewing troop levels. By Friday, May 1st, the Pentagon announced the withdrawal of approximately 5,000 U.S. troops from Germany, to be completed within 6 to 12 months. Trump said Saturday that America would be cutting a lot further. Here is what almost nobody reported about that sequence of events. The troop withdrawal was not primarily a response to Merz's comments. It was a response to the fact that Germany, like most of NATO, had refused to allow the U.S. to use joint military bases for offensive operations against Iran. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth called that refusal shameless. Several European allies also refused their airspace, and the internal Pentagon email that Reuters exclusively reported outlined options to punish NATO allies, including suspending Spain from NATO and reviewing the U.S. position on Britain's claim to the Falkland Islands. This is not a diplomatic spat between two leaders. This is the public surface of a structural transformation that has been underway for years. The United States is telling Europe, not suggesting, not hinting, but telling, that the protection relationship that has existed since 1949 is ending. And Europe, for all its emergency spending and summit declarations and rearmament rhetoric, is not ready. I call this the capability commitment gap. And by the end of this video, I want to show you exactly how wide it is, in numbers, in platforms, in industrial capacity, and in political will, and why closing it will take far longer than any European government is publicly acknowledging. I am a researcher. Every claim in this video is sourced from named institutions. McKinsey's February 2026 NATO Defense Dashboard, the most comprehensive independent analysis of European military capability published this year, the Friends of Europe's April 2026 Defense Gap Assessment, the Inter-Economics Journal's peer-reviewed analysis of whether Europe can deliver 5%, the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the Atlantic Council's Hague Summit expert reactions, GIS reports June 2026 rebalancing analysis, the NATO official data on defense expenditures, the CSIS defense budget analysis, the Courthouse News reporting on the 800 billion euros EU defense plan, and the CNN, NBC, Washington Post, and Al Jazeera coverage of the Germany troop withdrawal. I am going to give you numbers, sources, and mechanisms, not rhetoric. And I am going to give you the counter-argument, because it is genuinely strong. Then I am going to give you 3 falsifiable predictions. Let us start with what Europe actually agreed to at The Hague. On June 24th and 25th, 2025, NATO leaders met at The Hague, Netherlands. The outcome. The Hague Investment Plan was described by NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte as a transformational leap for collective defense. Trump, who was in The Hague for less than 24 hours, called it a major win. Every NATO member except Spain committed to a 2-tier spending target: 3.5% of GDP on core military requirements, personnel, operations, equipment, and maintenance, and an additional 1.5% of GDP on broader security-related investments, including critical infrastructure, cyber defense, civil preparedness, logistics, and the defense industrial base. Together, 5% of GDP by 2035. Let me put that in context. In 2014, after Russia's annexation of Crimea, NATO set a target of 2% of GDP. That target was meant to be reached over a decade. Many NATO members only reached it in 2025, 11 years later. Now, NATO has set a target of 5%, 2.5 times higher, to be reached in 10 years. NATO published its own data in April 2026. European allies and Canada increased defense expenditure by over USD 90 billion in 2025, a nearly 20% increase on 2024. Their combined spending has risen from 1.4% of GDP in 2014 to 2.3% in 2025. The trajectory is real. The money is moving. And yet, at The Hague, something important happened that the headline number obscured. NATO diplomats, according to reporting from PBS and the Atlantic Council, had to reframe key summit language, changing the word "we commit" to "allies commit," specifically to accommodate Spain's refusal to sign without an exemption. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez capped his defense budget at 2.1% of GDP and formally requested an exemption from the 5% target. Italy and Belgium raised concerns. Slovakia resisted. And here is the most revealing detail from The Hague, sourced from the Atlantic Council's expert panel immediately after the summit. What was not left clear was the future of U.S. commitment to European security. While the United States agreed to communicate language that reaffirmed an ironclad commitment to collective defense as enshrined in Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, little was communicated by Trump about the future of U.S. force posture in Europe. Europe agreed to spend more. America did not agree to stay. That asymmetry is the capability commitment gap in its political form. Spending more versus buying more. A critical distinction. Before we get to what Europe can and cannot build, I want to show you something that the Intereconomics Journal, a peer-reviewed economic policy publication, documented in its 2026 analysis of the 5% target, because it tells you something important about how this commitment is already being managed. Italy proposed classifying the long-planned Messina Bridge, a 13.5 billion euros infrastructure mega project connecting Sicily to the Italian mainland, as dual-use infrastructure contributing to military security. Under the 1.5% security-related tier of the Hague Commitment, infrastructure counts. So Italy's bridge could, in theory, count toward NATO defense spending. Intereconomics described this as widely interpreted as inconsistent with the intent of the new commitment, but the fact that it was proposed, and that it is not obviously prohibited under the agreed definition, reveals the structural incentive built into the Hague formula. The 1.5% security-related tier is deliberately broad. It includes critical infrastructure protection, network defense, civil preparedness, resilience, innovation, and strengthening the defense industrial base. NATO's own definition, as published on its website in April 2026, states this explicitly. Italy's Messina Bridge is almost certainly going to be counted. Roads, rail links, and port upgrades, all of which have legitimate dual-use military value, will be counted across multiple European countries. The February 2026 finding that should have dominated headlines McKinsey published its NATO defense dashboard in February 2026. It is one of the most comprehensive, independent assessments of European military capability ever produced, drawing on official procurement data across the entire alliance. And its headline finding is extraordinary. European NATO countries have spent more on defense in the past 3 years than at any comparable period since the Cold War. They have signed new procurement contracts, they have launched emergency production programs, they have donated weapons to Ukraine, and their total equipment inventory has shrunk. As of February 2026, equipment stocks in European NATO countries are still below their 2021 levels. Read that again. 3 years of record spending. Equipment stocks below where they started. The Friends of Europe's April 2026 analysis, drawing directly on McKinsey's data, explained the mechanism. The money is real. The output is not. Why? 3 structural reasons. First, weapons donated to Ukraine. Significant quantities of artillery, armored vehicles, and air defense systems. Left inventories and have not been replaced at equivalent speed. Second, legacy system retirements. Old equipment removed from service have not been offset by new deliveries because defense procurement timelines run 5 to 10 years from contract to delivery. Third, and most importantly, European defense procurement is designed to distribute industrial contracts nationally rather than to acquire the best capability at the lowest cost. The result is that Europe has spent record amounts acquiring fewer systems than it could have bought if it procured jointly. NATO's European members and Canada collectively spent more than USD 482 billion on defense in 2024. The Hague Commitment will push European spending toward 800 billion euros annually by the end of the decade. That is an extraordinary sum, and McKinsey's analysis suggests the existing procurement model is structurally incapable of converting that money into proportionate military capability. U.S. defense technology investment, according to McKinsey, is still close to 3 times higher than in European NATO countries combined. And that gap is not primarily a function of spending levels. It is a function of industrial structure. America has 1 defense technology base. Europe has 27. The most important number nobody is reporting. Here's the number I want you to remember from this video. 4. According to McKinsey's February 2026 defense dashboard, European NATO forces operate a set of military platforms that is more than 4 times more fragmented than those of the United States. What does that mean in practice? The GIS report's June 2026 rebalancing analysis, published just days ago, gives you the concrete illustration. Europe operates 12 different types of main battle tanks. The United States operates 1. Europe operates 12 types of fighter jets. The United States operates 3. And platform fragmentation is not just an aesthetic problem. It is an operational, industrial, and financial problem of the first order. Operational. 12 different tank platforms mean 12 different maintenance supply chains, 12 different spare parts inventories, 12 different training programs, and 12 different repair and overhaul systems. When a German Leopard 2 needs a part, it cannot borrow from a French Leclerc or a British Challenger 3. The logistics of a multinational European force, the kind that would have to operate without American backbone support, are incomparably more complex than the logistics of a US force operating 1 platform. Industrial. Friends of Europe's April 2026 analysis identified the structural cause precisely. European defense procurement is not fragmented by accident. It is fragmented by design. The accumulated design of governments whose defense industries are simultaneously strategic assets, employment programs, and instruments of domestic political patronage. France procures from French companies. Germany procures from German companies. European treaty law enables this fragmentation. Article 346 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union allows member states to derogate from EU procurement rules for security reasons. Most of them use it, routinely, as a legal mechanism for protecting domestic industrial interests at the expense of joint procurement requirements. The result? Joint European procurement accounts for less than 20% of total European procurement today. Financial. The EU's 800 billion euros defense plan includes a provision requiring 55% of all weapons purchases to come from European or Ukrainian manufacturers by 2030, and 40% of procurement to be joint by 2027. But historically, nearly 80% of European defense purchases have gone outside the EU, primarily to the United States. Germany's new military procurement plan shows 154 major defense purchases through 2026, with only 8% going to US suppliers. A dramatic shift. The European Commissioner for Defense described the 150 billion euros safe loan mechanism. All 19 subscribing member states must favor European manufacturers. American firms are largely locked out. And here's the strategic irony that Courthouse News documented in October 2025. Trump spent years pressuring NATO allies to spend more on defense. They are finally doing it. But they are not buying American. Trump created the spending surge that is now deliberately excluding American defense contractors from the largest European rearmament program since the Cold War. The last time Europe rebuilt its own defense, from near zero. Every time European rearmament is discussed in strategic terms, someone invokes the Marshall Plan, and the parallel is partially right. But I want to show you where it breaks down, because the breakdown is the most important part. The Marshall Plan, announced by Secretary of State George Marshall on June 5, 1947, provided approximately $13 billion, roughly $150 billion in today's money, in American economic assistance to Western European countries between 1948 and 1952. It was not primarily a military program. It was an economic reconstruction program. But its strategic logic was military. A prosperous Western Europe was a stable Western Europe that could resist Soviet pressure without requiring permanent American garrisoning. The parallel people draw is this. Just as the Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe's economic capacity from the ruins of World War II, the current rearmament surge, driven by $800 billion in EU defense spending, will rebuild Europe's military capacity from the neglect of the post-Cold War era. Here's where the parallel is right. The scale of the task is comparable. Europe allowed its conventional military capabilities to atrophy for 35 years after the Cold War. The NATO Secretary General's own data shows the European trajectory, 1.4% of GDP on defense in 2014. The equipment donations to Ukraine revealed stockpiles that were shockingly thin. The Marshall Plan analogy captures the magnitude of the rebuilding task correctly. Here's where the parallel breaks down. The Marshall Plan had a clear external funder, the United States, providing resources without conditionality beyond broad political alignment. European rearmament in 2026 has no external funder. The EU's safe loans are loans. They must be repaid. They are financed through deficit spending in countries that already face fiscal constraints. France had a budget deficit of 5.5% of GDP in 2025. Italy's debt to GDP ratio exceeds 135%. Germany's constitutional debt brake, the Schuldenbremse, was reformed but not eliminated. The Marshall Plan also did not require its beneficiaries to simultaneously build the institutional capacity to replace their security guarantor. After the Marshall Plan, the United States stayed. American troops remained in Germany. NATO remained the security framework. Europe rebuilt its economy under American protection. Today, Europe is being asked to rebuild its military capacity, while the security guarantor is actively withdrawing. There is no Marshall Plan equivalent, no outside funder, no institutional continuity, and no promise that the guarantee will remain while the rebuilding happens. Elbridge Colby, U.S. Under-Secretary of War for Policy, made this explicit at the NATO Defense Ministerial in February 2026. Europe must take primary responsibility for its conventional security while the U.S. continues to provide nuclear deterrence. Europe's conventional defense, not Europe's overall defense. Conventional only. The Intereconomics Journal's peer-reviewed analysis put the fiscal mathematics bluntly. For many European countries, raising military expenditure to 5% of GDP would imply a permanent and structural expansion of defense budgets of a magnitude rarely observed outside wartime. Tax increases and spending reallocations are politically unpopular. Deficit financing is the least contentious option, but it is not unlimited. Norway is the only European country that has demonstrated what serious commitment actually looks like. Norway committed to 5% of GDP at The Hague and has a targeted, long-term plan focused on Arctic capability, electronic warfare, and alliance interoperability. Norway's defense budget rose from 5.7 billion euros in 2021 to 16 billion euros in 2026, a near tripling. But Norway has North Sea oil revenues, a sovereign wealth fund of over $1.7 trillion, and a population of 5 million. It is not a template for France, Germany, or Italy. The condition nobody read in the Hague Declaration. Now I want to show you the most important thing about the Germany troop withdrawal that almost nobody reported. The Pentagon's official statement said the withdrawal follows a thorough review of the department's force posture in Europe and is in recognition of theater requirements and conditions on the ground. That is the official technical explanation. But the senior Pentagon official who spoke on background to multiple news organizations was explicit about the actual reason. The Europeans have not stepped up when America needed them. This cannot be a one-way street. And Reuters exclusively reported an internal Pentagon email that outlined options to punish NATO allies. Washington believes failed to support U.S. operations against Iran. Those options included suspending Spain from NATO, reviewing the U.S. position on Britain's claim to the Falkland Islands, and, according to multiple sources, reviewing intelligence sharing arrangements with allies who refused base access. What this means is that the 5% spending commitment is now necessary but not sufficient. The implicit new condition for American commitment to NATO is not just spending, it is political alignment. Specifically, it is support for American military operations, access to European bases for American offensive operations, and public silence when American strategy appears to be failing. MERS violated the political alignment condition by speaking publicly about American strategic failure in Iran. He was punished immediately and measurably. 5,000 troops, with Trump saying more cuts were coming. Germany, according to Times of Israel reporting, argued it had done more than most allies, allowing base use, permitting overflights, hosting the Landstuhl military hospital where Iranian war casualties were treated. None of that mattered. What mattered was the public statement. The Atlantic Council's Imran Bayoumi, a former Pentagon official, said it plainly after the withdrawal announcement. European leaders will likely push more to bolster their defense spending, viewing Washington as increasingly unreliable and untrustworthy. This is the capability commitment gap in its political form. The commitment Europe is being asked to meet is not defined in the Hague Declaration. It is defined by what Trump considers adequate loyalty. And that definition can change, retroactively, publicly, within 72 hours of a German chancellor giving a speech to high school students. Germany's defense minister Boris Pistorius tried to play it down, calling the withdrawal foreseeable and saying it showed the need for Europe to take greater responsibility. That framing is correct, but it also reveals something important. Germany is now publicly welcoming the withdrawal of American troops as a necessary signal of European self-reliance. That is a sentence that would have been inconceivable in German politics 5 years ago. The European Air and Space Shield, 600,000 defense workers, and the rare earth problem. I want to end the evidence section by showing you what Europe's 800 billion euros defense plan actually requires, in concrete, operational terms, because the headline number obscures several structural challenges that are not being discussed in public. The Courthouse News reporting on the EU's implementation roadmap, published October 2025, identified 3 specific requirements that will determine whether the plan succeeds or fails. First, 600,000 skilled workers for the defense industry by 2030, with 200,000 needed by 2026. Europe's defense industrial base was deliberately downsized during the post-Cold War period. The engineers, the manufacturing capacity, the supply chains, all of it was reduced or redirected. Rebuilding them requires not just money, but people. And 200,000 defense industry workers by 2026 is a demand that Europe's labor markets are not currently configured to meet. Second, a European air and space shield launching by mid-2026, connecting fragmented national air defenses and protecting satellites from potential Russian attacks. This is an extraordinarily ambitious program. Europe currently operates multiple incompatible national air defense systems. Integrating them requires the kind of command and control architecture that the US spent decades developing for NATO. Europe is trying to build a version of that in less than 2 years. The technical challenge alone is formidable. The political challenge, getting France, Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states to agree on a shared command structure, may be larger. Third, and most structurally dangerous, China controls the raw materials that modern weapons require. The rare earth minerals essential for drone motors, missile guidance systems, and other military equipment. Neodymium, dysprosium, terbium are primarily mined, processed, and exported by China. In response to the Iran war, China imposed export restrictions on several rare earth materials. Those restrictions directly affect European defense production. Europe's military buildup is structurally dependent on Chinese materials, and China knows it. There is no European rare earth supply chain yet. The EU's Critical Raw Materials Act of 2023 set targets for domestic mining and processing, but those targets are for 2030, and current domestic production is a fraction of what is required. Europe is trying to build a defense industry that is independent of the United States while remaining dependent on China for its foundational materials. That is the unresolved contradiction at the center of European rearmament. Prediction 1. No European NATO member reaches 5% of GDP in core military spending before 2032, and the accounting will be damned to Hague commitment set 2035 as the target year. The 2-tier structure, 3.5% core plus 1.5% security related, was designed to give members flexibility on what counts. I predict that by 2029, when the Hague commitment's first review is scheduled, fewer than 5 NATO members will be on track to reach 3.5% in core military spending. Watch for annual NATO defense expenditure reports, published each year by NATO's Public Diplomacy Division. The key metric is not total spending, but the 3.5% core tier. When you see countries citing cyber infrastructure, border security technology, and dual-use transport as defense spending, that is the accounting game beginning. Italy's Messina Bridge proposal is the leading indicator. The falsifiable element, if any large European NATO member, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, reaches 3.5% in verifiable core military spending by 2030, I am wrong on this prediction. Watch the annual NATO data releases. Prediction 2. The EU Air and Space Shield mid-2026 launch misses its timeline, or launches as a framework without operational integration. The EU's €800 billion defense plan includes a European Air and Space Shield launching by mid-2026. We are in July 2026. There has been no public announcement of an operational integrated air defense network connecting European national systems. I predict the Air and Space Shield will be announced as launched, but it will launch as a political framework, a memorandum of understanding, or a coordination structure rather than an operationally integrated command and control system. True integration, the kind that allows German and French and Polish air defenses to respond to threats in real time through a shared command, will take until at least 2028 or 2029. This is falsifiable. Watch for the launch announcement. Read the fine print about what is actually operational versus what is agreed in principle. A framework without command and control integration is not a shield. Prediction 3. Trump uses the Ankara NATO summit, scheduled for July 2026, to announce a formal restructuring of the U.S. force posture in Europe. The NATO summit is scheduled for Ankara, Turkey this month, July 2026. Trump said on June 26th that America's current NATO support is ridiculous when the relationship is not reciprocal. He said Europe was not there for us during the Iran war. Republican chairmen of both the House and Senate Armed Services Committees have already issued statements saying they are very concerned about the Germany withdrawal, but their concern is about moving troops east rather than bringing them home. I predict, at the Ankara summit, the United States formally announces a restructuring of its European force posture, framed as NATO 3.0, the term already being used by Elbridge Colby, in which American conventional forces are reoriented from Germany to Eastern Flank allies, Poland, and the Baltic states, and the overall U.S. troop commitment in Western Europe is reduced. This will be presented as a win, America focusing on the front line, while functionally reducing the U.S. conventional contribution to Germany, Italy, and Spain. Watch for any Ankara summit language about forward posture, Eastern Flank prioritization, and burden shifting rather than burden sharing. The language shift from sharing to shifting is the signal. I want to end this series of videos with a question that connects all 5 of them, because I think there is a single underlying dynamic that runs through the Strait of Hormuz, through China's institutional build, through the nuclear verification vacuum, through the India-Pakistan 96-hour window, and through NATO's capability commitment gap. That dynamic is this: the rules-based international order, the set of institutions, norms, alliances, and economic architectures that the United States built after 1945 was designed for a world in which America was the uncontested dominant power, and it has worked, imperfectly but remarkably, for 80 years. What we are witnessing in 2026 is not just a series of separate crises. It is the simultaneous stress testing of every major pillar of that order. The nuclear arms control architecture has expired. The alliance system that guaranteed European security is being restructured. The monetary system that underpins American financial power is being challenged by Chinese alternatives. The waterway that carries a fifth of the world's oil is under contested administrative control. And 2 nuclear-armed states in South Asia exchanged military strikes and the world forgot about it in 96 hours. These are not independent events. They are the outputs of a single structural transition. The movement from a unipolar world, in which American power was sufficient to sustain the order, to a multipolar world, in which American power is necessary but no longer sufficient. The question I want to leave you with, and it is the same question in different forms across all 5 videos, is this: can the rules-based international order survive its own structural transition? Can the institutions that were built for a unipolar world be reformed, adapted, or replaced by something that works in a multipolar one? Or are we in the gap between 2 world orders, after the old one has stopped working and before the new one has been built? If history is any guide, that gap is dangerous. The gap between the concert of Europe and World War I was dangerous. The gap between World War I and World War II was dangerous. We have been living inside the post-1945 order for so long that it is difficult to imagine its absence. But the evidence of 2026, across 5 separate and connected stories, suggests that its absence is no longer hypothetical. It is the condition we are already in. Think about that. Come back when I check the predictions, and share this with someone who should be asking these questions. This is the final video in a 5-part series on the geopolitics of 2026. The other 4. The compliance first paradox, why every US-Iran deal collapses at the same moment. The maritime leverage conversion, why the Strait of Hormuz will never return to normal. The institutional substitution play, what China built while America was at war. The verification vacuum, why the expiry of New START is more dangerous than the Iran war. And the 96-hour window problem, why the India-Pakistan conflict is not over. All 5 are linked in the description. If this series was useful, share it with someone who should be asking these questions.